ready to start. So my name is Lisa. I'm part of the Bioenergy Australia team, and I will be facilitating this webinar today. First of all, I would like to inform that you should all be muted during the presentations, just to avoid background noise. And your cameras should be off just to ensure a good band quality. So thanks for that. Questions will be right at the end after the last presentation. And in order to ask a question, you will be able either to type your name and organization in the chat box, which is located at the top on the right-hand side. Alternatively, you should be able to see a link on the chat box. If you click on that link and you download this small extension for Chrome, then you should get the opportunity to basically raise your hand when you have a question. So you can start downloading the extension during the presentations if you want, and then the speakers will answer the questions at the end. I guess you're probably aware that we are holding quite a good number of webinars during this period. And today's webinar is focused on the evaluation of a bioenergy project viability. We will hear from a range of experts, including consultants, investors, government and business representatives, who basically they could provide us some tips to ensure that you can potentially start off your project on the right foot, on the right direction. So our first speaker is Diane Glenn, who is the founder of Corelli Consulting, and she will talk about the process to evaluate the viability of a venture. So Di, I will leave it over to you if you want to share your screen. Yes, thank you, Di. We can see your screen.
Thank you, Lisa. I thought that I would, I can't see how I change the slides. Anyway, that's all right. I thought I'd start the conversation today by speaking very generally about project viability and the commercial feasibility testing from the perspective of the project developer. Can you see the slide change, Lisa?
Yes.
Thank you. The outcome of the viability assessment is to decide to direct investment in a project if the project itself is sound. Soundness or commercial viability means that the project offers the prospect of good financial returns to the investor at reasonable or acceptable levels of risk. So let's look at the process of viability assessment and what it means to the developer of a project. I'm going to start by offering some observations about the assessment process and reflect on the impact of the input data on the critical investment parameter of the project financials. Lastly, some reflections on the potential value to the project developer of external specialists. A viability assessment is generally a stage-gated process with key decision points, especially at pre-feasibility and feasibility phases. The viability of the project can reflect both hard and soft keys. Hard keys such as quantitation, such as feedstock, throughput and price, conversion efficiencies of the technology, etc. But soft keys can also be of interest to the investor. Contracts, particularly the security, period and pricing of agreements that the developer has negotiated with reputable customers, and other project partners, their role and provenance. Assessment is also an iterative process in which the project scenario is refined over time as data becomes more robust and contracts are progressed. So some key messages for the developer is to assemble reliable and reproducible data, plus secure agreements in readiness for assessment. Evaluation starts with the question of what is the project? At core, the project is defined by its essential components and each is equally scrutinised by the investor. The location, scale and operational readiness of the project's facilities and access to the grid or gas network. The technology provenance, whether it's been demonstrated at scale and with comparable feedstock. Inputs, what feedstock particularly, the nature of the supply agreement, the security of supply, and the key costs of feedstock delivered to site. In terms of outputs, co-products, if any, can impact on the project economics and the greenhouse gas saving. So for the main energy product, offtake agreement and period, especially with a number of customers, is important for the developer to evidence. These are the core inputs to estimate project financials, which evaluates costs versus revenue over the life of the project. In addition to the project's assessment landscape, they may also extend to issues that normally fall outside of the developer's focus. Risk analysis and having a strategy designed to avoid, manage or mitigate those risks clearly needs to be articulated. Risk analysis may challenge a project team who otherwise highlight the project's differentiation and advantages. Similarly, investment success may be influenced by the developer's awareness of the social acceptance or resistance to the project operation, whether there is availability of a supporting policy framework from federal, state and even regional agencies, and the provenance of operational teams, especially executive and management, and whether key production staff are secured to the site. If the government is a potential investor, then whether there are clear socioeconomic impacts in addition to baseline revenues, especially in regional areas, such as long-term employment and the attraction of other business to that region. And lastly, environmental impacts or benefits as a result of project operation. As we've discussed, financial modelling is the keystone indicator to the investor of the prospective viability of a project, the profit generated and the time to cash flow positive. From the developer's perspective, strategic and operational options for the project can be varied to optimise the financial position of the project. For example, the scale of the operation and whether the operation can be rolled out as modules. The balance that the developer achieves between capital expenditure and recurrent expenditure, for example, whether to rent or purchase equipment. So testing the sensitivity of the project financials to these scenarios may be good for the project developer to explore. Here we look at the prospective value of outside specialists to the developer in this process. The commercial feasibility due diligence that investors conduct often involves experts or specialists, in-house or third party, who, for example, undertake technical feasibility testing. Can the project be implemented as planned, using proven technologies and without unreasonable technical risks? Legal due diligence, are there legal barriers to implementation of the project, as well as environmental and social impact assessments? So it makes sense then for the project developer to prepare for that thorough due diligence and consider the value of engaging third-party experts to strengthen investment case by means of data collection and verification, or by an arm's length analysis, especially with respect to some of the key inputs into the financial models, such as engineering and technology production data, feedstock availability and sustainability, and the all-important market demand and dynamic. The core question to be asked by the viability assessment is whether the project offers good financial returns at a reasonable level of risk. So in conclusion, what are the key messages for the developer? Financials are pivotal to the investor taking a view on project soundness. Based on the business and operating model, the financials provide a snapshot of the project's potential cash flows, returns, and financial robustness. And the cost-benefit analysis of the project is driven by the input data and assumptions. So is the developer ready? Consider the use of third-party contractors to test key project data and to find and fill gaps in the spreadsheet. While a project is defined by the facilities, inputs, outputs, technology, and offtake, there may be opportunities to test aspects of operational scenarios and therefore optimize the inputs into the financial model. Note in addition that there are external aspects outside of the project per se that may influence assessment of viability, particularly from the perspective of government as an investor, who needs to decide whether a proposed project is a good use of public resources. So estimations of social license and socio-economic modelling become important. And lastly, remember that investors in general put an understanding of risk and its mitigation high on the investment agenda. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments at the end of the webinar.
Thank you very much, Diane. We now have the next speaker, who is Mac Irvine. Mac is the acting head of Waste and Bioenergy at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, CFC. And Mac will present a couple of bioenergy tools that are currently available to make assessments regarding project viability and opportunities. So Mac, over to you if you want to share your screen.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to Bioenergy Australia more broadly for inviting me to present today, and obviously all the listeners on the line as well. Thank you for your time today. Before we actually kick off and talk to each of the tools that Lisa mentioned, I just wanted to make sure everyone was actually aware of these on the Bioenergy Australia website. So I just wanted to pull that up quickly first and foremost. So, you know, very simply, if you type in Bioenergy Australia resources into whatever browser you use, you'll come to this screen that I hope you can all see. And if you look at bioenergy tools here, you'll see that the project assessment tool and project development timeline, which I'll talk to today, are free and readily available. So I would encourage anyone who's thinking about developing a project or currently in the development phase and wanting to think about, you know, the state of their progress or their status, for example, to explore that. I'm going to talk to each of these now, but I'll do it on a PDF because it's easier to navigate. So just bear with me. So hopefully that's coming through the screen now. So the first thing I'm going to talk to is the self-assessment tool. So maybe taking a step back, the genesis of this is actually that a number of years ago, the CEFC, Foresight Group, Arena and Bioenergy Australia started to think about, you know, what are some of the barriers and challenges in the market and in particular in developing projects. And one of the key barriers, we felt that there was a lack of investment-ready projects coming to market, and I guess a lack of sophistication in the market from a development perspective. So we basically wanted to reach out to the market and show them the sorts of things they should be considering as they're looking to develop projects to enable more investment-ready projects coming to market. So we put together what we call the self-assessment tool, which is on this screen, and also the development timeline on this screen, which I'll talk to in just a moment. In terms of the self-assessment tool itself, what we're thinking about here is three key phases. We call those pre-feasibility or fatal flaws analysis, the feasibility or commercial viability analysis phase, and then execution. And before going into a bit more detail, just I think worth everyone remembering that there's no golden rule per se when it comes to project development. You know, every project is different, whether it's different feedstocks, technologies, outputs, sites, etc. So there is no one size fits all or template approach, but we believe that this tool provides at least a really good kind of, you know, higher level sounding board, if nothing else, for people to consider. But also noting that a lot of the key elements, as I mentioned, feedstock, technology, output, etc., are all pretty common across a lot of projects and all worth considering. So in terms of each of the phases, we've got obviously there's some of the key elements. So feedstock, site, technology, offtake, and preliminary financial model. This is basically the stage at which you need to really understand, is my project feasible at all? And if not, why not? And what do I need to think about to get the project feasible? So, you know, stepping through a couple of those, you know, what's my feedstock? Where's it coming from? Am I paying for it? Am I paying to receive it? What impact is that having on economics? Is my technology considered commercially proven or not? If it's not commercially proven, how am I thinking about mitigating risks, etc.? And then from a returns perspective, obviously every investor, whether it's debt or equity, will be interested in what return their investment's going to realize for them. So, you know, if it's 5%, why? If it's 25%, same question, why? And thinking about, you know, how the project components are all kind of manifesting to deliver different outcomes. In terms of stage 2, so subject to going through phase 1 and deeming it to be, you know, feasible in terms of the early stage of fatal falls analysis, then we get into a bit more detail around some of the other key project components. So as you can see there, capital structure, you know, so how much debt or equity is going to be in the project, EPC and O&M, so construction and operations, you know, who's the counterparty, are they sophisticated, have they done it previously, etc. Reputation of the key counterparties that are involved. Environmental and planning approvals is absolutely fundamental. As most of you on the call probably know, Australia has, you know, certain challenges when it comes to regulatory approvals, processes and frameworks. And so those can take longer than expected. And so investors will always take a view on when's the right time for me to become, you know, materially involved or look to support a project based on the approvals process. Community support is critical. Safe to say social license to operate is something that can't be forgotten in these sorts of projects and has to be dealt with. Otherwise, investors just unfortunately won't look to invest in projects. Grid connection, if required, whether that's gas grid or electricity grid, or there might even be behind the meter solutions. The financial model, again, that's looking for an updated financial model. So hopefully by that stage, you've got more kind of certainty or clarity around your key inputs and therefore outputs too. And then construction equity if required as well. Subject to getting through the second phase, we move on to the execution phase, and this is kind of where the project all comes together. So you've got, you know, your debt and or equity, you know, confirming the quantums of those, subject to whether or not it's feasible to have debt in the project. In terms of the due diligence around your, you know, technical or technological solution, legal due diligence, insurance due diligence, tax, financial model, and others. These are all sorts of things that are absolutely fundamental for any investor. And I guess on that note, we would always advise to engage with advisors, you know, sooner rather than later, whether that's a commercial, financial, technical, or legal advisor. You know, bioenergy projects are inherently complex and challenging, particularly in the Australian market, where it's a less mature market compared to other jurisdictions globally. So at the appropriate time, we would always advise people to get in contact with advisors, and that's absolutely something that the CFC or Bioenergy Australia can support as well in terms of making connections in the market. So that's a bit of a high-level summary of the assessment tool. I won't go through it in detail because it's probably best for others to click on the link and go through it. But the self-assessment tool actually then goes through each of the key factors I've just mentioned and assigns what we would consider to be a low, medium, or high rating. And that's effectively looking at whether or not something has a high level of risk or low level of risk. So just to take the top example here being feedstock, a low rating would be no specific feedstock source identified or being at risk of not being available. So effectively having an inverse relationship between a low rating and therefore a high risk. And similarly, at the other end of the spectrum, a high rating being feedstock contractually secured from a creditworthy counterparty, including quality, volume, and price, and transport risks minimal. A high rating there is a good thing and obviously means it's a low risk. So as you work down each of those factors, you know, you've got feedstock, site, technology, offtakes, project returns, development equity, EPC and O&M considerations, reputation, and also comes into your kind of social license to operate, community support there as well, approvals, grid connection, and financial model. So as I say, there's a fair bit of information there, and in the interest of time, I won't go through it in detail, but there's a lot of information there for people to consider. And I think the final comment to make is that at the end of this self-assessment tool, there's I guess a black and white version of the first slide, which allows people to think about all of those key components, give themselves a low, high, or medium rating, and then basically is a bit of a sense check as to where their project is in the development cycle. Next, I'm going to talk to what we call the development timeline. I'm going to zoom in here because, as you can appreciate, the text is quite small. So what we've got here is basically the three key phases at the top being pre-feasibility, feasibility, and development and execution phase. And then on the left-hand side here, we've got the concept phase, the contractual arrangements, funding, due diligence phase. So stepping through each of those really quickly, as you can see, the timeline going from left to right for feasibility to execution. In terms of the concept phase and the key components, so feedstock, site, technology, grid and offtake, and financial viability. That's fundamental to decide on whether or not you're going to proceed further, or you need to start to tweak some of the key components of the project. We then move through the feasibility and development phases, and that's where your environmental and planning approvals come in. You start to look at your EPC and O&M, and obviously your detailed EPC and O&M pricing design phase as you move forward. In terms of contractual arrangements, just moving this to the top, you typically won't be in a position at pre-feasibility phase here to have contracts, negotiated and signed. You might have MOUs or letters of interest or letters of intent. But when you get to the commerciality phase, absolutely you'll need to identify your key counterparties, look at the contractual arrangements to make sure it's bankable or sufficient to attract equity, looking at EPC and O&M, feedstock, grid operator requirements, leasing or purchasing of land, etc. And then obviously fine-tuning that in this phase here, which is your your execution phase. In terms of funding, sponsor equity funding is basically a requirement all the way through the development cycle. So as you can see there, it moves its whole way across. Fully appreciating that development equity or sponsor equity is pretty hard in the market to attract, given it's a high risk level of capital, but absolutely fundamental to any project to move through. Grant funding is absolutely available across Australia in most local or state jurisdictions, and even the federal level as well. And obviously any grant funding supports project economics. And then third-party equity and debt, if applicable, you're starting to look more around this section here, which is kind of just at the end of your fatal flaws analysis or working through commercial viability, and then obviously fine-tuning to ensure the right level of capital coming in at the execution phase. Due diligence does occur kind of all along the way, but in terms of when you're looking for your final reports and support from key due diligence advisors, the key reports are finalised in the execution phase here. But notwithstanding, you need to have a high level of confidence that the project will be supported, and so you need to give some consideration to that a lot earlier. So I might leave it there. Again, thanks for listening. Happy to take any questions at the end of the call. But as I say, just to reiterate, both of these tools are online under the resources section of the Bioenergy Australia website. And I would encourage anyone and everyone to look at that to do a bit of a sense check on the projects they're looking to develop in future.
Thank you very much, Mac. That was really a great overview, and I think the tools can be really useful for anyone who wants to start a project. So we now have a government representative, Mary Levitska. She's a Bioenergy Industry Development Officer at the South Australia Department for Energy and Mining. So Mary will talk about South Australia's approach to basically support project development. So Mary, the floor is all yours if you want to share your screen.
I will. Thank you, Lisa. Share. Can everyone see that? Yep.
We can see it.
Okay, cool. I'll get off this first one pretty quickly because that's very bright. Just to start with, I'll just go through what we're going to cover. So I'll just give you a quick rundown on the focus of the South Australian Government around renewable energy. We'll have a little bit of a look at what we've done over the past 4 or 5 years with bioenergy industry development, including a roadmap that was commissioned in 2015. We'll have a look at some funding in terms of both the bioenergy roadmap and also some renewable energy funding that has been accessed by bioenergy projects, and then just have a little bit of a look at the learnings from what we've done so far over the past 4 or 5 years. So let's have a look. So basically in this area, we're sitting in the Department of Energy and Mining, and the Clean Energy Transition Team, and I sit in the Low Carbon Industry Development Team within that Clean Energy Transition Team. So basically we play a vital role in ensuring that the South Australian renewable resources, which are fairly abundant, especially in wind and solar, combined with the government's major investment in renewable energy projects, is leveraged to establish and grow significant new industries, provide opportunities to new and existing local suppliers, and support the creation of new sustainable jobs within the state. Within the Low Carbon Industry Development Team, we try and unlock the economic value of the state's clean energy transition to renewable energy by supporting economic recovery and generating economic growth, contributing to nationally competitive energy pricing security and reliability, and trying to reduce carbon emissions locally, nationally, and globally. Some key areas of focus for the South Australian Government are large-scale renewable energy generation and storage, such as wind, solar thermal, solar PV. Bioenergy sits in there as well, batteries, pumped hydro, and thermal storage. And then we look at demand side energy such as rooftop solar. Bioenergy sits in there as well, distributed storage, energy efficiency, as well as demand management. A big one at the moment is hydrogen production, use and export. We've got a zero emissions vehicle strategy at the moment as well. So looking at vehicle uptake and investment in charging and refueling infrastructure. We look at supply chain development of low carbon technologies, including a battery focus and bioenergy, and research and industry partnerships in low carbon technology. So that's kind of where the South Australian Government priority areas are in terms of energy. So the industry development that we've been doing in South Australia sits around working to remove barriers to investment, and some of this is through policy and regulatory changes. For instance, there was some regulatory changes around access to land access for wind farm development, provision of commercially relevant information to potential investors. So that, for example, the Bioenergy Roadmap for South Australia, which I'll talk about briefly later. We work with companies to develop projects in South Australia, including funding programs, Crown sponsorship, matchmaking, so technology providers, consultants, and business and industry, leveraging federal government funding, grants, loans, providing contacts and introductions, etc., and working with business and industry groups to help catalyse investment in bioenergy. So we've been doing some forums and industry engagement, providing investor information and things like that. So the South Australian Government has been actively engaging in some hotspot areas that were identified during the Bioenergy Roadmap development. So we're looking to lay the groundwork for new bioenergy projects by providing information on bioenergy alternatives for electricity and heat production, link biomass suppliers to users of energy, and demonstrate how local businesses can be supported to add value. This has been undertaken by delivering a series of Bioenergy Roadmap forums in these identified hotspot areas and by utilising local support networks in the region. So to assist with this, the Low Carbon Industry Development Team has developed the Bioenergy Roadmap programs, which is about $175,000 to support regional businesses in developing projects. Whilst we see that this funding is often administratively complex for such a small amount of money, we understand that it's often difficult to start this process and get approval from, say, management or boards, or to provide early stage funding for these pre-feasibility and feasibility studies, such as Mac was talking about earlier. The outcomes of the funding mean we've been able to put together a knowledge base of viable projects, and this will further allow us to assist with providing high-level information when the funding is no longer available. If you want any more information around that funding, it's not very much left, but there's still a little bit left in the bucket for the pre-feasibility. We've also co-invested in the ABBA project, which was part funded by ARENA, and mapping and further information can be found on the Australian Renewable Energy Mapping Interface, and there's a link there. So if you get the presentation later, the links are in there. So just mentioned earlier about the Bioenergy Roadmap for South Australia, which came out in 2015. So this defined the resource and the demand. We explored the opportunities and supported early work. We provided advocacy and industry and stakeholder engagement, and as mentioned, the seed funding. So the hotspot areas were developed by looking at areas that had sufficient feedstock quantities. We matched demand for heat and electricity with commercial or near commercial conversion technologies, and we looked at logistical issues, for instance, low logistical transport between 40 and 50 kilometres, and high issues would be around further than 100 kilometres. A report was generated, and there was GIS data as well that was loaded onto a web-based application. So the other things we've been doing around the second stage were exploring the potential for those projects in regional areas. So we worked in those hotspot areas, and as mentioned, we put on some forums and work with regional communities and agencies to see how we can develop the opportunities in those regions. The South Australian Government has provided various funding and bioenergy to bioenergy projects across a number of programs. So we've had the Renewable Technology Fund, which was $150 million, and that provided funding to a couple of bioenergy projects, one of which was assisted with $1 million for that early stage development, and a further $5 million to help build the facility. The Energy Productivity Program funded 3 small scale bioenergy projects for businesses with high energy use, which include a composting facility, a grain processing facility, and a meat processing facility. And all of those 3 are being built at the moment. And there's various waste management and resource recovery programs through Green Industry SA. So the outcomes and benefits, we have a resulting knowledge base of viable and non-viable projects in South Australia. Of course, that's very high level. So we also raised awareness of what the stakeholders, who the stakeholders were, for example, South Australian-based consultants, technology providers, industry players, available and applicable technology for various feedstock types, highlighted roadblocks and difficulties in project development, highlighted various state-based and Commonwealth funding streams that were applicable to bioenergy, which we were able to pull together instead of people having to look around and hunt around for on various websites. We were able to pull those together and hand those out at our forums. And we have provided a network of government and industry stakeholders, which is invaluable. I believe that's one of the main things that has come out of this. So I guess to finish up, we've really found that the reflections, I think, are that funding is very challenging to secure, and bioenergy projects are seen as a higher risk, especially in South Australia, where we've got large solar and wind resources. Large scale in bioenergy is hard to achieve, even with proven bioenergy solutions like anaerobic digestion. Locking in feedstocks is pivotal but quite difficult. Bioenergy projects are often competing for funding and offtake or generation and connection with proven and cheaper technologies like wind and solar. And I note here that South Australia has strong wind and solar resources. It's harder to get projects to stand out in South Australia due to those wind, solar and battery options being easier to source and easier to get funding for because they're less risky. I don't think South Australia has the same competitive advantages of other states. For example, Queensland has vast amounts of available residues, and New South Wales and Victoria have higher and less distributed populations, which make it a little bit more challenging in some areas of South Australia. Bioenergy is often a niche solution, especially behind the meter applications. And often these energy generation and waste disposal is not business as usual for a lot of these businesses, and they don't have the in-house expertise, skills or funds to do that project development, as Diane was mentioning earlier. I've added just a few links there to some resources that we have on the Renewables SA website, and happy to take any questions later. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mary. So our last, well, but not least speaker, we have an industry representative, Kane Ravenscroft. Kane is the sales director at Optimal Group Australia, and will provide insights, basically from a successful project perspective. Kane, over to you if you want to share your screen.
Thanks, Lisa. Can you see my screen? I should be sharing it now.
Yes.
Oh, yep. I can't see anything.
Just a second. Maybe I actually have a black screen now, but I thought it was just
I've got a black screen as well.
Ah, okay. So it's not just me.
Well, let me try and present it again. Share. Can you see me now?
I still can't see anything. Maybe we check with the other speakers. Mac, are you able to see Kane's presentation?
Yeah, I can see it. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, then I assume everyone else can. If that's not the case, I'll ask the participants to write something on the chat or send me an email. Okay, good to go.
Or feel free to use your imagination, whatever works.
I think I'll have to do that.
Sure. So I sort of spun the title of the topic from covering yourself to project steps to success, and I sort of want to talk about that in delivering what it takes to get a successful project up to development stage and then take it through to commissioning and application. So 2 seconds about us. We're basically a solutions business. We distribute a power generation product as our core part of our business. It's a micro turbine, which is basically a jet engine in a box, and we have just over 480 of those running across our territory, which is Australia, New Zealand and Fiji. But a very small fraction of that, and probably less than 2%, is currently in the bioenergy space. We do have a hydrogen unit going out to a project in Sydney next year, but we do have some existing biogas projects, and I'll also talk quickly about some projects that we missed out on and lessons learned internally from that. So really, and the reason why I'm talking about success is in our world, in this side of the business where we're doing behind the meter customer solutions, really partnership should really cover the customer and yourself from risk. So it's not just about covering yourself from damage. In this case, it's about making the project successful. And for us, there's an education process that needs to happen. And the first thing is there is a perception with some customers that have biogas that biogas is essentially free, but it's the reality is it's not. Those quality projects are capital intensive, and a big part of the process is building trust and transparency. And the ways we do that is quite often with open book methodology in contracting, where we show the customer our costs and we work with them so they can become comfortable that the project cost is what it needs to be, but primarily the right customer completely understands that it's long-term value. They really understand that over short-term aspects, and might be easier said than done, but for us it's really starting with the right customer, and there has been projects where we've walked away, and they have a long-term outlook. So typically they may be companies that have strong sustainability goals, or companies that are privately owned that maybe have a longer-term view as well. And they look at biogas as a tool to de-risk their business, both the energy, the emissions, and their waste impact, and certainly their social license is definitely a big one. And they almost always apply more realistic payback expectations. So, it's not uncommon for us to have industrial customers look at 18-month, 2-year payback hurdle rates, and payback is a really poor metric for these sort of applications, because the long-term value, the NPV, is usually much higher. They have some really strong stakeholder engagement across their entire business, from their sustainability to operations and the executive level, and that's obviously challenging in the early stage. And of course, they either have appropriate budgets for capital investment, so they're not trying to shoestring it, or they're open to alternative funding, so they're open to different ownership structures. So in terms of project de-risking, there's probably one thing that needs to be thought about front end, which is quite often ignored to the detriment, which is things change. And for an end user project, a behind the meter project, those things can be multiple things. So biogas, of course, it's an organic process, and it's entirely related to the feedstock. And there's also external factors that can change the production value. So it varies with both quantity and the quality of the gas. And of course, for end user behind the meter applications, energy demands change. So they may develop more energy efficient processes, go on efficiency drives to reduce their consumption. Their production might change. They might add shifts, take away shifts. They might have seasonal or structural changes to business. So it might be cyclical sort of business or project driven. And more so, they might look to do additional things behind the meter, such as solar PV. So essentially, any generation technology you must think about the flexibility and the adaptability to cope with those changes in the future, not just designed for now. So an early lesson learned, we had a customer actually based in South Australia. We're talking to a large abattoir who had a biogas resource, and this customer was very mature. And what I mean by that is they'd actually been producing biogas for a long time, using it in their boiler. They really understood they've got a large cal, and they really understood their biogas resource. They're a very large power and thermal user. In fact, a lot of our customers are majority thermal users. At the time, they had a capital budget set aside, and that really drove us to look to do a low-cost solution on the heat recovery, which you'll see was the detriment to the project. So we did a lot of front-end engineering in design based on the belief that the project was solid and sound, and we had a good chance of doing it. So we did a lot of engineering, site surveys, drawings. We spent a bit of time and money getting that up. But this was at the start of the gas market volatility, which has crippled Australian industry in a lot of respects. And at the time, their consultant forecast that they can expect natural gas pricing of up to $20 a gigajoule, but critically didn't expect their power prices to remain stable. Now, did expect their power prices to remain fairly flat. Critically, that didn't eventuate. Obviously, their gas price did go up, but their power price was quite stable. Was not stable, sorry. And they concluded that it was better to keep. So when you did the sensitivity analysis on the modelling, you put those parameters in terms of input costs, and it completely changes the business case. So the client concluded it's better to keep using the biogas in the boiler. So a key takeaway for that point was really that maximising the total efficiency, so ignoring the capital constraints and worrying about the project valuation at the front end, trying to recover as much thermal energy off the back end completely de-risks that business case. Well, not completely, but majority de-risks it. If the price of gas goes up, then the value of the heat avoided goes up. So this is an existing customer in Melbourne. We have a wastewater treatment plant, again, a mature biogas operator with a wastewater treatment plant. They've invested in a biogas reactor as well. They've got a digester there producing biogas. And they had originally, from a previous distributor before we were a distributor, a single 200 kilowatt microturbine, so an existing technology user. They have an extremely variable biogas, so the calorific value or the methane quantity changes more significantly than what we'd normally see at a biogas application. So the methane quality can range from 55 down to slightly below 40%. So turbines are naturally more adaptable to those swings, but even that swing is too large for even a microturbine to handle. So then they also had multiple availability issues that were compounded by other factors on site. Some of the installation and design around some of their balancer plant was causing some reliability issues. So they came to sort of 40,000 hours, which is the typical overhaul time, and we worked with them and decided to replace that single microturbine with 3 smaller ones. And we also provided a solution on that application where we have LPG, so we've got a gas spectrometer on their digester. We measure the methane content. If the energy content's too low, then we blend with LPG to bring the methane index to the lowest point. So we always can burn gas regardless of volume and regardless of methane quality. So the conclusion there was really maximising flexibility, both from the fuel point of view, but also the modularity point of view was critical to make sure there was uptime and availability. So quite often in a lot of projects we look at, the customer will try and select the largest single generator they can, but then they've got a single point of failure and a single point of failure in their business case. So this brings this all together to a current project we're doing. So we have unfortunately I can't mention the name of the customer, but we've got a large multinational food producer, North American based, but have a manufacturing facility in the east coast of Australia. They have probably the most aggressive targets for decarbonisation across their business. We've worked with a company to date. They're very experienced around digesters and covered anaerobic lagoons. They actually have power generation assets internationally and manage wastewater treatment plants and digesters at all of their sites. And they recognised the volatility in the Australian energy market was an issue for sustainability of their business, not just from an environmental point of view, but certainly from an economic point of view. The volatility was very hard to manage in forecasting profitability of their business. So some of the challenges that they've thrown into this as well, they're also building a 5 megawatt PV plant on site. So this adds additional supply variability on top of the demand variability, which generally is a bit of a challenge if you're investing in on-site generation. Roughly 2/3 of their energy is thermal, so they need much more heat than they do electrical, and the grid is relatively constrained in their area, so they can't convert to electrical, and there's other issues with biomass on that site that's not an option for them. But critically, they want to maintain flexibility. There's additional solutions that they're integrating down the track, and one of those is hydrogen. So there's a requirement to be flexible, and there's a requirement to be flexible in when you generate and what fuel you use. And they were really focused, for us, it was good. They were focused on trying to get the maximum utilisation of that biogas. So use as much of as possible, not just from using it when it's available, but recovering the most energy out of it. So their biogas source is from 2 sources. They've got a covered anaerobic lagoon, which is producing biogas and has been for a long time. And they've also, under construction, a solid waste, using their solid waste, which goes out currently to farms. They're going to recover that in an anaerobic digester. So like all those applications, the gas is not completely stable. There's variation in calorific value and the amount of gas. So, but we have enough gas to generate 1.2 megawatts of power from microturbines 24/7. So that's the design parameter that's gone into this site. Solutions based around this technology out of the US, and you can read about it later, but there's a number of things that are specific to that technology. But the solution is basically a drop-in power station. So that's one of the advantages that we sold to the customer. It's got some things in there that bonuses, and there's also some things that aren't required. Again, I'll skip through. But to simplify the solution further, they're available in packaged solutions. It's important to understand when you look at the final solution that they're available in boxed solutions with multiple 200 kilowatt modules. And that modularity goes right back to that initial comment on that wastewater treatment plant customer that we talked about. So the solution they've selected is 1200 kilowatts, which is essentially 2 boxes, each box with 3 turbines connected onto a common bus. And that completely de-risks that single point of failure. So any one of those turbines, if they're offline for any reason, whether deliberately or we shut them down for service, the rest of the package can run. So that sort of de-risks that all eggs in one basket that we commonly see with these sort of projects. They're very tolerant to that range of calorific values in biogas, and I can send out information if people are interested. They're tolerant to high levels of hydrogen sulfide, a common pollutant found in biogas. And importantly for them, we can also blend or completely run on natural gas, and we can also blend up to 20% hydrogen in that unit as well. So that completely de-risks the fuel quality concerns with biogas. If they have an issue with low production or no production, then they can run that asset on natural gas, albeit with less value, but still some value. And as I said before, we can switch any of those off, and that provides a cascading level of redundancy. Critically, we can run that whole solution anywhere from 100 kilowatts to 1200 kilowatts and anywhere in between for any period of time. So if their demand drops, we can drop the amount of power. But also it's responsive to gas flow. So we can, if the gas flow is reduced, we don't have to run all those modules. So that de-risks that fuel production concern, and also de-risks the fact that they're probably not allowed to export in that site. So if demand drop, they can drop the amount of capacity they're running. So the last part of this solution was really about how do you recover the heat. So in the combined turbine, we've got over almost 2.5 megawatts of heat in the exhaust, and we were looking to try and maximise the heat. So the first option we looked at was really hot water, and just taking a single turbine, we get 390 kilowatts coming out of the exhaust. And we've got a simple solution, just a onboard, basically hot water heater or heat recovery module that gives us about 250 kilowatts. So reasonably efficient, but we still lose 140 kilowatts. So we still lose about 35% of the heat we don't recover for a number of reasons. But the big challenge with this customer is that they're really a steam user. There's not a lot of use for hot water, and a lot of industrial customers tell us the same thing. Not worried about hot water, we want steam. So the second solution was to look at a low-cost steam option, which we have, where we can put a not on top of the unit, but a steam recovery unit that gives us about 180 kilowatts, but the losses are much higher. So we're only getting about 45% of the available heat recoverable as steam. So not a great outcome. Stacks up today, but as we said, if the gas prices continue to rise or something else was to change, then that would certainly put some pain onto the business case. So the solution we've selected here is quite a simple one, but quite practical. So that exhaust is 18% oxygen, so it's very similar to hot air. So we can use that as combustion air in their existing boiler. So they've got a 25 megawatt steam boiler. We displace the ambient air at 20 degrees C with 280 degree heat. So that recovers about 95% of the available thermal energy from the turbine. So that de-risks that variability for us on that side. So last slide is really just a impact, really focusing on the emissions. I didn't put anything about the economics, and that really drove the project. The customer wouldn't have invested if it wasn't financial, but I thought this was quite a powerful indication. So this is the information from the customer. So the solar array is going to have a bit of an impact. The biodigester and cogen system, significant impact. Offsite PPA is the next stage in their it's a renewable PPA for procurement of their energy. Then energy efficiency and an electrolyser on site to take them to a zero emissions balance. So in terms of the impacts, it's not quite 20% of their total emissions reduced, but of course behind the meter for these customers has an oversized impact, especially if it's dispatchable. We have an impact on their demand costs, and we have also removed the distribution and transmission costs and associated costs from that power. So quite a powerful sort of solution. So that's me in a nutshell.
Well, thank you very much, Kane, and thank you to all the other speakers and to everyone who listened, of course. We are running a bit behind our schedule, but I think we can still get a few questions, maybe 2 or 3. So as a reminder, you can either raise your hand if you downloaded the extension, which should be on the chat. If you haven't downloaded that, it doesn't matter. You can still just type your name and organization in the chat, which should be on the right-hand side on the top. And then, of course, I can unmute you and you can ask your question. So I'm just checking if there are any questions at the moment. So I currently don't have any questions. So while you're thinking about your question, I might ask a quick question, probably mainly to Mac. So I think you kind of touch about this. Touch on this. But generally speaking, when do you think a project proponent should approach an investor? And probably this question can also be the same for Diane for in terms of consultants as well, maybe. So, Mac, do you have any insights in terms of timing? Is it the sooner the best? How does it work?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Happy to talk to that. So I think that look, and reflecting on the tools that I mentioned earlier, I would suggest for project proponents to at least go through their, pre-feasibility stage to actually have some semblance of whether or not a project's likely to be viable. Ultimately, it's up to the project developer or proponent to approach investors, whenever they see fit. And obviously, people will go later or sooner depending upon what works for them. However, I guess what I would caution is that if you go too early, then if an investor says at that time that it's not ready for them to look at, if you go back to them at a later date, they've obviously already got, I guess, a thought in mind as to whether or not the project is likely to be viable. So I would caution people as to going too early to the investment community. The CFC, on the other hand, is very happy for people to approach us at an earlier stage, and the reason being that given we're an Australian Commonwealth government-owned entity with a much broader remit in the sector to support projects and support industry more broadly, we're happy to have earlier stage discussions with people. And whilst, we're not an advisory firm by any means, as an impartial investor, we're happy to provide some thoughts around what investors in the market would look for, whether or not a project is likely to be ready for other people to consider as an investment opportunity, etc. So there's no hard and fast rule, but I would suggest that at least work through the pre-feasibility phase and have some of the components of the commercial phase or commercial feasibility ready. Obviously, the further progressed you are, the better. But at the same time, if you go all the way to putting a project together and then it turns out that you've kind of structured it in a way that investors or banks perhaps don't like, that's obviously not a good result either. So it is a bit of a tricky question because, as I say, there's a whole range of different variables in there. But in summary, I would suggest at least work through the pre-feasibility phase and have some of the components of the commercial phase ready, and then approach investors on that basis. And I would also say, just as one final point, every project has risks, so don't assume that your project won't have risks. Investors and financiers are very happy to accept risk as long as it's been well thought out and well considered by the proponent and has mitigation strategies in place. So don't feel as though the project has to be risk-free, because that is just impossible. But as long as you've given a lot of thought to that, I think that's a really good starting point for the discussion.
Well, okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Mac. And Diane, do you have any insights in terms of consultants from a consultant perspective?
Well, I think Mac has covered the answer really well.
Okay.
In that you don't get a lot of bites off the cherry with an investor. You need to be quite ready with your project plan because they do form a view. And if they form a negative view, it's very hard to claw that back when you return to the investor with a better proposition or a more investment ready proposition. At the same time, you need to understand what the investor needs to see, the particular type of investor, what they need to see from your type of project, So a fair bit of homework and perhaps some initial relationship building is good, but don't go to them, don't plan to go back to them. Do it right the first time. So.
Sure. Well, okay, thank you. I know we are definitely close to the end of the webinar, but we have one question from Brendan George from New South Wales DPI. Brendan, trying to unmute you. Are you able to unmute yourself? No. Well, anyway, so Brendan has a question for Kane. Is asking, does the heat utilization shift the efficiency downstream?
Sure. So I think what Brendan's asking is if the solution that we offered the customer versus if they had used hot water, would the overall efficiency be lower? And the answer is yes, because for a number of reasons, the exhaust is still relatively hot when it leaves the heat recovery module. So we go from about 93% overall efficiency down to sort of 70, 77, 78%. So absolutely the efficiency is reduced. It is in some applications simpler to use hot water as heat, but it also depends on the temperature of the hot water.
Great, thank you, Kane. Brendan, does this cover your question?
Thank you.
Okay, great. So if there are no more questions, since it's already 4:05, I would close the webinar here. Just as a reminder, I will share the presentations and hopefully the recording as well to all the attendees and just after the webinar, probably this afternoon. And if you are interested in participating in our future webinars, you can go to Bioenergy Australia website under the event section, and you can find all the webinars there. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night, afternoon, whatever it is.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you so much to the speakers.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.